Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I'm excited to share my newest design. I'm going to be showing simple techniques to create this unique background, paint a rustic wooden church, a warm glowing candle, festive pine cones, and add some vintage touches. This project is simple, easy, and impressive, and I think you're going to love it. Because I'm using an MDF tag, I'm treating it the same as I would any other wood surface. I'm going to seal it well with multi-purpose sealer. This will just ensure a smooth surface, making sure my paint's going to adhere well and my brushes are going to glide seamlessly over the surface. Using an 1.5" short wash, very soft bristled brush, applying the medium from the center area out towards the edges. That way I don't have any medium that drips over the outer edges. Because the brush is such a soft bristle brush, it's easy to smooth it out and quickly cover the surface. And just using long strokes, making sure that I smooth it out nice and evenly. Going to let that dry really well, give it a quick sand, and the surface is going to be smooth as silk. Helps to make your brushes last longer. You get nicer, smoother strokes as well. Decided I want to create a background that is shifting from dark to light, showing a little bit of movement. Base coating the entire background with bleached sand using a 3/4 inch oval wash. Again, this is a very soft bristle brush. I'm using the flat of the brush, not the chisel edge, to apply the paint, and I'm stroking from the center out just to make sure I don't get any drips down the side edges or excess paint. Once I go out to the edges, I'm a little bit freer and I can slip slap a little bit more easily than trying to be careful around the edges. And I'm allowing the brush strokes to show, but I'm still covering the entire surface. That's just the base coat. Now I'm going to begin applying that interesting background. This is a very carefree application, and I know I want it to be lighter on the top left and get a little darker towards the right side and towards the bottom. I live in Ohio. It's very humid here. I have a lot of open time. If you struggle with your paint drying too quickly, then a distress sprayer or a quick a glazing medium will help extend that open time. Picked up a little bit of spa blue, starting to add some color, and I'm blending it into the wet paint. Never do I clean my brush. I just go from color to color. I don't have heavy paint on my brush, so when I pick up another color, I just let it naturally blend in, creating that look of light to dark. And make sure that you have enough paint that it can be manipulated easily without having it dry. And if you do need that extended time, pick up some glaze medium or use that distress mister. I did mist it. You can see it's very shiny, and it allows me just to work that paint a little bit more. I love seeing that brush stroke. I did pick up a little bit of portobello just to add some earthiness. I wanted this to have a touch of that vintage feel, and I thought that portobello is just kind of musky and deep without adding a lot of, without changing the color tone. And it just helps that paint shift. Not too concerned about the middle area, but I do want to blend it all over. If it becomes too dark, I simply pick up a little bit of the bleached sand to soften it down. And more can always be added. I always am a little bit light-handed. It's so much easier to go back and add than it is to try to figure out how to take some of that down. Just letting it shift. This almost reminds me of the old portrait painting backgrounds with the brush strokes in it. It allows that background to be very interesting without becoming the focal point or outshining or becoming too busy, I guess I should say. That was a little bit bright or dark, so I just picked up that spa blue to soften that down. There's a lot going on. Keep in mind the different elements that are going to be added, so I'm not being too particularly fussy. I just really enjoy this part, so I probably spend more time on this than I really need to. But remember, it has to be completed before the paint dries. If it starts to dry, just let it completely dry and then go back and continue adding more paint. I did trace on the church pattern. I wanted to have that indication of pine branches in the background. Loaded my number 5 radical round with thicket, and it's pretty thin, so I can stroke it on for a good bit of time. This is going to go behind the church, but I wanted to get the church on there for placement, just to make sure that it was going to be in the correct place. I've not painted this before. This is the first time I designed this and painted it, so there's a lot of thought process going on while I paint, trying to figure out exactly what I want to do and how it's going to look. So you'll see me hesitate quite often, and that's just, I'm thinking, do I want to add this or that, or continue on? Just using that thicket to add those soft pine branches in the background. And the Radical Round is one of my signature brushes I designed and developed. It has a fat belly and a little point on the end of it, so I can fill it with quite a bit of paint and create a lot of brush strokes before I have to reload. Adding a hint of thinned plantation pine just to give that color of green. Stroking it on very loosely. This is going to be a very subtle background element, so it doesn't need to be super strong. It was a little bit more intense than what I had intended, so I'm going back with spa blue. I'm hoping that will tone it down, so it's not, I don't want this to be a foreground focal point. I want it to be just kind of quiet in the background. And as I work with the spa blue, I'm kind of thinking it's really pretty, but it's still a little bit stronger than what I had hoped. So I'm continuing to add. I don't want any empty spaces around the branches, so I'm kind of filling it in. In my mind, there's a Christmas tree in the background. The little church candle is on a shelf in front of that. When it dried, it was still very, very strong, so I'm taking a little bit of thicket just to shade it around that outer edge. I'm hoping that's going to tone it down and soften that impact of all those branches back there. And after I finish shading that on there, it's still a little bit strong, so I picked up some plantation pine just to soften that even more and bring out that color. Using the chisel edge of my brush to do those brush strokes. Going to let that sit there a while, and I'm base coating the roof line of both the steeple and the church with Portobello. I'm using my number 5 Radical Round. You can see what excellent control the brush provides. It not only is a liner, but I can use it pretty much as a flat and get a nice, if I keep an even pressure, a nice straight stroke. I can paint stripes with it. I can use it to base coat. It's just an excellent little brush. Going to my 1/2 inch awesome angle and bleach sand to base coat the church. And I love an angle because the point of the toe provides a nice, I can get in all those little angles. I can use the chisel edge to do line work with. Such a versatile brush. I can get right up in that peak with that way the brush is angled and pull that down. Now once I paint under the roof line, I'm going to keep my strokes going vertical because I don't necessarily need a solid coverage, but I want that indication of the boards going up and down. It's kind of interesting to have a little bit of that blue background glow through. So let the background work for the design. Doesn't need to be solid and heavy and covered up completely. Not only does it streamline the painting time, but I think in the end it also creates an interesting result. So after I painted that in, I decided those branches are just too strong. So I picked up a little bit of spa blue on my oval wash, thinned it down, and I'm just applying a very light glaze over top of those branches. And you can see how wet the paint is. Blending it out, picking a little bit of thicket, just blending it out. That background is so varied that adding more and painting over it is just such an easy decision. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just make sure there's no spots, and it's just such a hint of paint. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. That's such a motto of mine. And I did go over the roof a little bit, but it's just right now it's just base coated that Portobello, no big deal. The paint is super, super thin. You can see how wet it is from the reflection of the light on it. Just make sure there's no hard edges. If you like the real-time videos, let me know. I did take out some of the dry time and some of my fiddle time, but it just gives you a better idea from start to finish what all's involved. Wanted to add just a little bit of a contrast to that opening of the church, and after I add my candle glow, this is going to be very subtle. It's not even probably going to show up that much, but it does make a difference. So it just helps to crisp up that outer edge. Deciding what to do at this point while the sky dries. Going to lighten that center up just a little bit, just tapping in some paint. It's when you see this paint going on, it looks much stronger than it actually is. It's so thinned down that it just really is almost a wash as opposed to a base coat. Using my 1/2 inch awesome angle to put bleached sand on the base of the church. And see how that toe of the brush just automatically fits with that angle of the base almost perfectly. Just stroking it across. Again, I'm not too worried about it being perfectly smooth and even because I'm using those brush strokes to create that look of planking. Loaded my palette knife, and I love using a palette knife. You just have to be a little bit more careful as to where the paint is applied, but I slide it across a very, very, very thin puddle of Snow White on my palette, so there is just a light skim of paint on the bottom of my palette knife, and as I scrape it across, it just creates a very just a hint of texture that is almost impossible to replicate with a brush. Love how it looks. Gives that weathered, worn kind of chip paint effect. Don't worry about being too precise because I'm going back with my brush to pull it together. I don't want to say blend it in. I'm just using that to pull it together. using the chisel edge of my 1/2 inch angle to sharpen those lines up and pull up some more of the vertical look of planking. It's just this is probably my go-to brush that I use most of all. This is one of my signature brushes. It has a longer length on it, so I have more stroke time before I have to reload. And it just gives me that extra working time that I can use to create more continuity. Kind of messed up in that little point. I want to make sure those are the details I want to keep perfect. Picked up raw umber on the toe of my 1/2 inch awesome angle, just using that to add some shading underneath the roof line on both the steeple and the church. Once I float it under the eaves, then I pull it down to reinforce that look of planking or wood boards, down the front. The paint is very thin, which means I can manipulate it for quite a while and spread it out and work it down. So I float it across and then take the chisel edge of my brush to pull it down. Just crisping up the edges of the structure where the top meets the bottom will be a little bit of shading. And again, just float it across, pull it up, and behind the roof on the church, and again, both sides of the steeple. I usually do all of the shading for one unit all at the same time, and then as it dries, it's much easier to go back, build it up as needed. So it's a little bit on the light side at this point, but I prefer to work the whole section at the same time instead of completely finishing the bottom and then finishing the top. So I've added the shading on the church, and now I'm going to add the same balance of shading on the roof, and this is where I can go in and clean up the roof. Wasn't too concerned about getting the white in there because I will be going in with white to add some highlights on the roof. Pretty much what I'm doing is just using the toe of my angle to strengthen the bottom edge of the roof line, and then staying up on the toe to add the effect of wood grain on the steeple roof. It's mostly the right side and across the bottom that will be the highlights. Now remember, this bottom base for the church is going horizontal, so very little of this is going to show by the time I get all the greenery added, but I still don't want to omit building up the shading, because as soon as that is finished and there's one place that you didn't mess with, that's the one that's going to show. So just going back to strengthen that a little bit. Once it dries, you can see if it's going to need a little bit more, and I think even later on I will go back and add more shading. It's hard to know how dark to go on the shading until all of the brightness is added. So at this point, it's not a whole lot to go on as far as balancing out the light and the dark. Picked up just a bit of the Snow White, and I'm only using the toe of my palette knife. I didn't use the whole bottom. For this, I'm sliding the edge of the palette knife through the Snow White paint, and this is going to just give a spattering of snow across the top of the roof. And I just use the edge and pull it through, and then I can kind of go up and down, and it's really a great way to add those little skinny highlight lines, and just kind of rock it back and forth. Make sure you maintain that straight directional so that the direction of the palette knife is what you will see. So I just want to straighten up that, add a little bit of highlight. And if you're more comfortable using a brush, go back to a liner to get those straight lines. I'm going to brighten up the church just a little bit more. And it is a little bit, it takes practice to get the palette knife thing correct, but it can be easily manipulated as well. I've loaded my number 5 Radical round with bleach sand to paint the cross on top of the steeple. And I will be adding a little more detail to that. It needs to be really bright. I just think that the cross is kind of the highlight of the church, so it really needs to stand out. I'm going in with my Epic script liner, kind of twofold. I'm using it to brighten up the cross, but also to straighten it up and define those edges. Picked up just a little bit of raw umber. This is basically the shading. I'm just adding pretty much a little drop shadow below and to the right. On this left side it doesn't show up well, so I can go in and add that hint of color with that little tiny line, and it just helps to create that contrast. Next, I'm going to just take a few minutes to look at the church to see if it's wide enough, bright enough. Did a little floating to highlight the roof, and white always looks more intense on when it's wet, but it's just a very light float. Kind of helps to smooth it out, sharpen up those edges. Anywhere that it looks a little spotty or blotchy, I can just float very lightly over it with the Snow White, and it just smooths it down. Wanted to really brighten up the edge of the opening where the candle goes, and just basically make sure it's balanced out and bright enough and light enough. I did sketch the candle in. I used the chalk pencil. This one is water soluble. I love it because if I forget to erase the lines as I paint over them, they're going to disappear. That's a wonderful aspect, but also you have to remember when you paint over them, they disappear. So if you want your lines to be there to see as you paint, know that these will disappear. I'm taking my number 12 flat number 10 flat, and I'm just base coating the barrel of the candle with bleach sand. Only did one coat on this, and I just pull it down nice and straight. I went in with a clean brush and lifted the center out so that a little bit of that blue shows through. I don't know if that's going to make a difference, but I thought that it would be nice to have a hint of that blue. By the time we add all the layers in, I really think that kind of disappeared. Taking my diverse dry brush, this is the number 12, and bleach sand, load the brush up, wipe it over a paper towel to get rid of excess. Then I'm gently dry brushing around the area behind the candle flame. And this is so nice because the diverse dry brush is one of my signature brushes. It has almost a little point on it, so that it's really easy to hone in specifically. And I wasn't too concerned about getting a little bit of candle glow on the outside of the church, but I definitely wanted that area inside to be bright. I went in with bleach sand first, let it dry, and then I brightened it up with a little bit of Snow White, and that's going to make it shine. I wanted the candle to be mostly white but have a warm glow to it, so I am taking a little bit of cocoa, thinned it down really thin. I'm just washing a little bit of color around the outer edge and across the bottom. Now I'm going in with my number 5 Radical Round and bleach sand just to lay in those wax strips. And I love doing wax strips because you can't do them wrong. They're just wax that's dripped down. So keep in mind the way that the drips kind of flow and roll. I like to have them a little bit uneven. Using my 1/4 inch angle and cocoa just to define underneath that shadow edge. They just need to be different heights and lengths on the drips. Have the number 12 diverse dry brush and Snow White to brighten up the center of the candle barrel. I want that yellow to just glow, not be the color of the candle. Going in with Snow White to highlight those drips, and you see how I can create layers of drips just by adding a little float of Snow White. To create the wax strips, I usually do several layers of color just to add that dimension. Brightening up the center of that candle just a little bit more. Taking some thicket, believe it or not, to strengthen the shaded areas, and it's mostly below and to the right of the drips, a little bit in the candle. I was hoping some of the background would show through, but it didn't. I painted the wick raw umber, and then I thinned down cocoa. It's just, you can see how wet the paint is, very, very thin. And I'm mostly patting it on with my number 5 Radical Round, going back and lifting out the heavy paint in the middle. I didn't want it to be a dark candle flame. I want it to be very sparkly. Adding some thicket to the bottom and right side of the drips, trying to decide how I want those drips to lay. And you can change your mind just on how they're shaded as far as how many drips you want and where the roundy part is. I have Snow White. I'm just brightening up the highlights just a bit more. When it dries, it's kind of hard to see, so and a little more on the barrel. So as I build up the layers of wax, I reinforce the highlights just to define them. Added a little bit of baby duck into the middle of the flame area to brighten it up, using the number 0 diverse dry brush to dry brush some candle rays out with Snow White. Such a great tool to have. Just very easy to add these little details that make such a big difference. Load the brush, wipe it off, and then I'm doing the same thing on the barrel. Again, I'm brightening up the barrel. I wanted it to be white with just a little bit of glow to it. So even though it started out darker, I can brighten it up. Using the toe of my number 5 Radical Round, just to tap and pat some white in the candle. I did a little bit of raw umber in the barrel and then brighten the back edge with Snow White. I want that candle to just kind of dance and sparkle. So I'm patting in some stronger highlights. This is the chalk pencil I like to use. It's water soluble. I know I wanted 3 pine cones. I did a rough sketch, and you'll see it. I think it shows up later on in the video. But because this is the first one I've painted, what I sketch out isn't always the way it's going to end up looking. So just going to go in with my number 10 Fabulous Fantastic Filbert, kind of defining that shape of the egg, and then I'm using the side edge just to pull in those different layers of pine cone scales. And you can see how thin my paint is. It's not solid and heavy. This is a real good visual for me. I can just basically rough it in, get the direction and the structure of the pine cone. On this little one that's facing the center, kind of a challenge, but I knew they kind of circle around almost like the center of a rose. So I'm just stroking in around the center to create those scales like they're wrapping around. On the side one, it's just going to be a little easier. I'm doing like an egg shape. Once I get that in there, then I can go in on the chisel edge of my filbert and just kind of pull to create that layers of scales. And the scales are in layers, but they're in rows, but each layer can be staggered almost like a stack of bricks. I've loaded my Radical Round with thinned black green, and this was a major design change that I did later on, so don't worry too much about the pine needles in the background. Just focus mostly on the foreground because I decided I didn't like all of that in the background and I ended up taking them out. So, but I wanted to get an idea of where the foreground pine needles were going to lie so that I could build on that. And I want make sure that they lay flat, that they're not standing straight up. Going back with burnt umber to reinforce those layers of paint scales. Make sure the paint is thin enough that you can manipulate it, move it around, and not have to paint heavy, thick layers on. And by adding these scales over top of what I've already done, you can see how it strengthens them. Loaded cocoa on the toe of my number 10 filbert. Press down, you see it gets a little frown stroke. Keep that in mind. At the top of the pine cone, I'm using that same press down to create those little rounded tips of each one of those scales. And I can do that like that. But I want the scales to open up as they go down, so I'm turning my piece upside down, so if it was right side up it'd look like a smile stroke. So it's easier for me to turn it upside down and press to create that stroke. Allow it to go outside of the edges so it's not perfectly lined up down the sides. And I go back, this can also be changed a little bit, and I do change it. You'll see how I changed the direction of some of those, or the form of the pine cones. Don't try to rush, just push, push, push. On this pine cone, I thought it would be behind the candle, but later on I decided I wanted it in front of the candle. So I did go back and restructure that a little bit. Even though they're at a certain point, you can still go back and adjust it. And this looks like it all comes together. It's just such a fun technique. To me, it's almost magical the way it works out. They're starting to get too lined up. Can you see how they're just a straight row of those scales? So I'll go back in and fix that. This is bleached sand. I want to add some highlights on the tips of those scales. It just helps define them a little more. That cocoa was the highlight, and now it becomes like a middle tone. And be careful where they overlap. Keep those separated. Even though we're using all the same tones, when I add the shading in there, that's when they really divide out and start to take better form. And this is where I'm just making sure that those scales kind of wrap around that center, and I don't believe I'm really following that underneath scales as much as making sure my pine cone is coming together with the right form, if that makes sense. So I'm just kind of building out, start in the center and just build it out almost like a flower. And I'm adding a little extra in there because it was too lined up. And even later on I go back and add some more. Don't pay attention to the greenery around the candle. I changed all of my mind on that. It was just a little too messy. I was going to take it out, but I thought it would be kind of fun. If you saw what design struggles I go through sometimes, they're not always exactly, sometimes they work out exactly the way I want, but sometimes I have to make some pretty definite changes in them. This is where I'm kind of splitting up that way it goes straight down. I use my chalk pencil to add the pine needles in and the berries, but that was also changed quite a bit too. Going in now with raw umber to divide the pine cones out and add some shading. And think about the light source pretty much from the candle flame. So the shadows are going to be from the center out. And so the bottoms and the right side over on this pine cone. I did the pine needles, I eliminated those around the candle and I painted leaves, but I didn't have the camera on because it was kind of an ordeal changing all that out. And I forgot to turn it back on. So this is a little step-by-step to show how I painted the leaves. Took my Epic script liner and black green to line the center branch. Double loaded my filbert, and this is a number 8 filbert with black green and foliage green. Press down and twist. Press down and twist. If you don't have a nice even press and twist, you get a partial leaf. Has a little jag on it. So slow down, don't try to go fast, and blend the paint out each time you load it. If it's not blended in the middle, you'll get a divided leaf. We want just that soft blend in the middle. Going back to my Epic script liner and black green to connect the leaves to the branch. And I'm working on paper. It's kind of hard. The paper sucks the moisture out of your paint and the brush drags a little bit more than it would on a painted surface. But the leaves were really dark, so I decided to go in with spa blue and do the center veins. Tried other colors, but nothing really worked. After I did this, I decided it made them look very delicate, and with all of the pine needles on around the pine cones, needed something totally different for the candle. Make sure to put a little curve on these veins. It keeps them looking a little more natural and less straight. Went in with a touch of thicket. I'm using my number 4 awesome angle, but it's a little bit too bulky to put that on. So I dropped down to the 1/8 inch, which was just perfect. Just need a hint of color, and it changes those from a dark black green to a kind of a dusty blue, which really goes well with the whole color theme of this design. And you can see they're in there now. Going back with bleach sand, I kind of changed that outer edge. I told you I was kind of, well, when I painted those pine needles away, everything looked a little different. So I went back and readjusted the side edge just by tapping on some more scales and putting that highlight back on. This is raw umber, and I've already got my pine needles stroked in there, and I use black green and foliage green and plantation pine, but I'm kind of tucking that raw umber very, very thin. This is my shadow color, so it can't be thick and heavy. It just needs to be a hint of color underneath all those pine needles. It doesn't cover up the pine needles, the color of the pine needles. It just deepens them down. Wanted to be sure to keep my strokes going horizontal to keep that tabletop looking flat. There's still going to be many layers added to that. Added a little bit of raw umber. Remember that candle flame's going to cast a shadow to the right of that pine cone. Very, very thin paint, very thin. Same on this side. It was just so bright. I'm using thicket on this side because the left side's a little bit brighter, but I wanted to bring that deepness in. Keep that very thin and washy. That background needs to stay very fluid and light as far as movement. Decided to add berries in the leaves, just kind of sketching in where I think they should go, but that's not always where I put them. It just gives me a good visual on placement. Using the handle end of my brush and wild berry, I wanted them to be varied in size so I can dip dot and kind of jump around so they're not like little soldiers in a row. Vary the size and kind of scatter them all about. When dip dotting using the end of a brush, it creates this tall mound of paint. So what I do is just take the handle of my brush, wipe it off, reach in and lift out that paint until it's most of that roundness is kind of diminished. The leaves just didn't stand out very well, so since I used Spa Blue for the center vein, I thought that would kind of help make them pop against all of that darkness. I love the look of it. It's very vintage, and it creates another element of interest. It almost looks like a print to me. I like that Spa Blue, so I'm pulling it in different areas, adding it in the pine needles. I'm going to be adding several layers to the pine needles. Started out with black green, then I bumped up to plantation pine, foliage green, which is really nice, but they're very dull. Adding the Spa Blue in there really brightens them up, but yet it still keeps that earthy pine needle color tone. It doesn't take away from that. Make sure that the pine needles are not all just straight. And by adding layers after I create different elements, they can also overlap, which adds a little more dimension. Make sure that paint's thinned down so that the paint flows easily off of the liner. If it's dragging, just add more water to it. And this takes a little bit of time, but gosh, what a difference. Look how delicate those pine needles are becoming. And I don't want to say change direction, but I do add movement to those. Adding some of that thicket on the scales that are in the shaded area. Just a little touch, not heavy, not a lot. Just enough to tone it down. Look how that pulls it all together with the background, with the pine needles. It's just a really great touch of color. A little bit makes such a big difference. Adding a little bit of shading with cranberry wine using my 1/8 inch awesome angle. Again, this has a longer bristle, and I'm able to shade quite a bit before I have to reload. Most 1/8 inch angles are itty bitty short, and you can get about one stroke before you have to reload, and I can do quite a few. This will add, that wild berry is kind of on the rosy pinkish side. The cranberry wine is going to bring depth in. It makes those berries look a little bit richer, a little more festive, a little more Christmassy. I wanted to add a sparkle on the berries, but I didn't want it to be a perfect dip dot. I wanted it to be like the candle flame is a little bit dancing, and the berries are catching different kinds of sparkles. So I'm using my stylus. Instead of dotting, I'm just kind of, now on the little ones I did dot, but on the bigger ones I kind of move it around a little bit just to spread that paint and make it a little irregular so that it looks like a sparkle. Let me know if you have any questions. I always check my comments to make sure that if you have any, that I can get back to you right away. Pulling some of that Spa Blue in the foreground tabletop where that candle is going to highlight. Put it in, it looks kind of heavy, a lot of water, and then I can just move it around, soften it down, and just blend it in. Look how easily, and it just adds a nice little bit of brightness there. Going back to the steeple, I do jump around a little bit, but that helps me to get a good balance. Everything's going on at the bottom and need a little more going on at the top to balance that out. Adding, again, I'm just using the toe of my palette knife to add a little bit of texture. Epic script liner to really brighten up that edge where that candle flame's going to hit on the church candle holder. These are the little details that make a big difference. Be sure to subscribe and hit like, that way you won't miss out on future videos. I thought the leaves looked like they were just sitting there, so I'm taking a little bit of thinned raw umber and I'm adding a drop shadow below the leaves. Don't let it get too bright or too dark. This just needs to be very thin, very transparent. This is a shadow. I was using my number 5 radical round. It was just a little bit too big and bulky, so I bumped down to my number 2. I have a little more control. Anywhere in the background where there should be a shadow flowing off of the leaves and berries, just add a little hint of a shadow down there. Going in with some raw umber just to tone down that thicket in the shaded areas. Just a hint of color. That little bit makes such a big difference. Need to add a little more darkness down in the corners. This helps to draw the eye towards the candle. A little more brightness on the foreground. And this is with a little bit of Snow White, but I've thinned it down, spread it around. There's my rough sketch that I changed many, many times. Well, not totally, but enough. Okay, so I'm using my painter's pal to add the berries. This is bleach sand. I decided to do a couple different sizes just to make it a little more interesting. Loaded my spectacular stencil brush with paint. If you're not familiar, my stencil brushes are a very soft bristle, super easy to stencil. You get a very beautiful stenciled image. It's not going to be scratchy. It's going to be very soft. You can rinse the brush out in water and go to the next color. You don't have to wait until it dries. Just a beautiful brush to work with. I never liked to stencil until I created this stencil brush and decided it wasn't me, it was the brush that I wasn't friends with. So if you have trouble stenciling, try these brushes. I'm almost guaranteed you're going to love them, and it's going to change your opinion about stenciling. Load the brush, wipe it over a paper towel, get rid of the excess paint, and tap it for more of an opaque coverage, and swirl it for a dry brush. I put the bleach sand on, let it dry, and now I'm going back with Spa Blue. That's going to change the look of the berries. It's not going to look like the same as the church. I wanted to keep the same color family, but change it up a little bit so that it looks very different. If the berries were bright white, they would be too much of the focal point. I'm going to keep that on the candle. Makes it easy to give perfect berries. Circles, bubbles, anything round. It's just really great. Let it dry, and I'm going in with Thicket to shade these berries. I use my finger a lot to blot excess paint. Remember where the light source is coming from the candle, so I'm going to make sure that that shading is on the bottom and the highlight is facing the candle. This Thicket is such a great color It's not a showstopper color, but boy, it really plays a big role in adding drama and dimension. It's a subtle touch that creates a big impact. Let that dry, and while that's drying, I'm going in with raw umber and adding a shadow below the berries so it looks like they're actually sitting on the table instead of floating. Little touches make a big difference. Using my 1/4 inch angle, my paint is very loose, it's very thin, so it's easy to manipulate it. Putting a little bit of shading around the berries just to make sure that they look like they're settled in and that they're casting a shadow. Because I use such a little bit of paint when I float, I can go back and add a second float if I feel like it's not visible enough. Adding a highlight with Snow White, really brighten those berries up. When the Snow White dries, it dulls down quite a bit, so I'll be adding a little bit more on those berries to elevate that highlight just a touch. Using my 1/8 inch awesome angle, it's just so great for small rounded shapes to add perfect shading and highlighting. Had to add the stems for the berries. I'm using Portobello. That way it's a little bit different than all the other colors. I'm using a rounded stem that just gives a little more movement. And I'm still not finished with the pine branches yet, so want to add more around the berries. Add a little highlight of bleached sand on those berry stems just to help make those a little more defined using the Epic script liner. Look what a difference that makes. These little touches of paint are just magical. I wanted to keep the berries bright but tone them down a little bit, so I'm using black green to shade even darker, and that really makes a huge difference. It richens them up, it deepens them down, but it also allows them to still be nice and bright. Make sure to follow the candle flame for shade placement so that the highlights on the berries will face the brightness of the candle flame. I'm using my 1/4 inch awesome angle and black green. That color just coordinates with everything going on in this design, works out really well. Now I'm going back with foliage green to add another layer of pine needles, and the pine needles that are on there are like the background needles, and this is adding more coming forward. Now that everything else is in place, it's easier to know where to place the pine needles. Using foliage green and my Epic script liner, kind of keep those pine needles going in different directions so that they don't look flat. They kind of flare out and just create a little bit of whimsy, and it makes them very delicate and very light. Switched over to Spa Blue to add that top layer that will really push those shadows down in there, and look what a difference. Especially pay attention, you can add these Spa Blue highlights in those deeper dark areas, and it just creates a little bit of frilliness. I did cut some of the spinning out because I turned my plaque so that it's easier for me to pull those strokes towards me, so I didn't want you to get dizzy as I flipped the plaque all over the place. So I just kind of went over, looked at the dark areas where it needed a little bit more fullness. It helps to break up any areas that you're not real thrilled with. You can flow some needles in there. I did one side, did the other side, then go back. So it's not finished until you decide that you're finished with it. And just add a few here and there, and then take a look overall and see if it balances out, if all the pine needles are nice and bright. I am putting a little bit of reflective light with Baby Duck and my 1/4 inch awesome angle. This is the light that's reflected off of that candle glow, and it's just a touch. It's not going to change the color of the leaf. It's not a nice long smooth shade. It's just a little splash of color that will make it look more like a reflection than a part of the leaf shading or highlighting. I thought it would be fun to add a little bit of that reflective light on some of the parts, the scales of the pine cones, and these will just be the ones that catch that light. So kind of keep a visual on where that candle flame's going to hit. I did add a little thin line on each side of the candle flame, and this just helps to reinforce that glow, pull the eye in toward that flame. I thought it would be fun to put a little bit on the berries, and I'm still using my filbert. It just has a hint of color in it. Putting a little wash of highlight on those pine needles just gives them that warm candle glow. Here and there, not everywhere, because not everywhere gets that same brightness. There's hardly any paint left on my brush, but I have enough on there I can put a yellow glow on that halo, and then a few little pops on the wax. Using my Zero Diverse dry brush to dry brush over that yellow on the berries. I wanted it to show, but it was a little more intense than what I had intended. So this will just tone it down. And while I was at it, I thought it would brighten up that highlight in front of the candle. This is such a great tool. Everyone should have this set of dry brushes because it really adds so much. I decided to put some music notes in the background, and I forgot to turn the camera on, so you're just getting a portion of that. I loaded my spectacular stencil brush with Thicket, wiped off the majority of the paint, and very, very gently just dry brushed the design on there. Love the effect of the notes. So I decided to use my Diverse dry brush, this is the Zero, to add a little bit of that yellow candlelight glow in the foreground. This is a good time to look at everything. I decided the shadowing beneath the eaves was a little bit on the light side, so I went back and deepened that up. That helps balance out the steeple. And speaking of the steeple, I thought the roof was just a little bit too quiet, so I brightened it up a little bit. That brings that brightness towards the top. And I'm just using Snow White and my angle just to add some strength to those highlights. To continue on with that vintage feel, I've put that little skim of raw umber on the bottom of my palette knife, and I'm keeping my palette knife probably about a 45-degree angle and just kind of sliding it on the edge of the plaque. Creates a nice dark border that's super thin, pulling just a little bit of that texture down. Almost looks like, oh, it's a little bit aged, and it creates that little bit of texture that really enhances the overall design. Bringing this dark raw umber up to the top kind of continues that darkness up at the top and helps to balance out down below. Just a hint of paint on the bottom of the palette knife. Keep this very light, don't overdo. I decided I needed to add a little wreath on the top of the church. I've loaded my Epic script liner with thinned raw umber, and you can see I'm just kind of doing a squiggle line in a loose circle. This is not a long connecting line. I want it to be a grapevine wreath, but I'm not doing a solid intertwining of the grapevine. This is far away and it's going to be really tiny. Now I'm bumping the color up to burnt umber and very thin, just kind of adding little squiggly lines to start to fill in the wreath. I wanted it to look very delicate and have a lot of interest. Picking up cocoa, this is going to brighten it up a bit. I can always go back and add more, so I stay on the thin side until I get all the colors in, and then I can see if I need to add more darkness or lightness, whatever. So I picked up a little more raw umber. There's some really thin spots. The left side of the wreath is heavier than the right side, so I'm just basically rounding it out. Remember, there's going to be all kinds of berries and leaves on it, so it just needs to be a nice roundish shaped base. It doesn't need to be solid or heavy. Just needs to look very delicate. Picking up wild berry with my stylus, I'm just going to dip dot some berries around. I decided it would be a little more fun to have different colors of berries. I'm also not reloading every single time. That will give me a difference in the size of the berries, having little ones and larger ones. It's just a little more, to me, it's just a little more interesting. If it's all perfectly placed, then I'm not sure that goes with this design as well. Letting some of the berries spill out around the edge, I think that looks kind of whimsical as well. And I'm alternating between not only sizes, but also the different colors. And I'm creating clusters in different areas, so it's not perfectly balanced. Double loaded my number 2 radical round with foliage green and plantation pine. The first leaf didn't have enough plantation pine, doesn't show up well, so it's real easy to see if it's loaded correctly. So you want that two-tone when you touch it down. Just taking the tip, touching down, and pulling out just a tad. It's such a little bit of a stroke. These are teeny tiny leaves. You don't need to create a lot of work. Just press and pull. Creates that perfect little football shape. Just kind of sprinkling the leaves around here and there to fill in the empty parts on the wreath. That's why it's important not to fill it up really solidly. It makes it difficult to find places for the leaves. Don't overdo. Just a few here and there. More can always be added. And take a look at it and see if it seems well balanced. That's more so important than being evenly placed. Adding a little sparkle of white just to brighten it up. That cranberry wine is a really dark color. Without the highlight on it, it just kind of disappears. And on the highlights, I'm dotting the big ones first, and then as the paint gets thinner on my stylus, I can bump down to dot those smaller berries. I did add a few random just white dip dots here and there just to kind of help add a little more even balance on the sparkles. Loaded, I did let it dry really well. Loaded the toe of my 1/4 inch awesome angle with thinned raw umber. Remember, there's the raw umber shadowing everywhere, and the wreath needs to have a little bit of that same shadowing on it as well. And I did go back also after I added the shadowing and shut my camera off. I was looking at it, and I did pull a little bit of thicket into some of the green leaves, a couple of the berries here and there, just to bring that blue up into the wreath. And I think that's perfect. It just needed that little touch to finish the church up. To add the lettering, I created a stencil, and it can be hand painted, but I really struggle with painting all the letters, and I'm kind of a perfectionist. I know exactly how I want it to turn out, and using a stencil just provides a safe fail-proof way to add the lettering perfectly. I know exactly how it's going to turn out, and it's evenly spaced. The lines are nice and straight. So using a stencil is a painting tool, and I can use my decorative painting skills to kind of ramp it up so it looks more hand painted than stenciled. I did load my number 4 Spectacular stencil brush with black green. I thought about making the letters black, but I thought with this whole overtone of the blues that would be a little bit too stark and a little bit too flat. Even the soft black I thought would be too strong. This black green just blends in perfectly with the overall look of the design. I loaded my brush well with the black green, and then you can see I wipe it off on a paper towel to remove that excess paint. And that excess paint is what will cause a problem when stenciling. My bristles are super soft. If you wipe that excess paint off, then all that's left are those soft bristles. And I'm just doing a light pound, so I'm not pounding it hard with those soft bristles. It just is such an easy way to add the color without making it run under or get blobby. I did give it a quick dry. When I taped the stencil on, I put a little piece of tape at the top that acts as a hinge, so I can lift it up, take a peek underneath of it, pull it straight down and tape it securely at the base, and I know it's not going to shift out of place. For the second coat, I'm just giving it a very light dry brush, and I'm using a little soft circle, not pressing hard, but that's just going to even up that base coat. Gives it a soft look when it's finished. And you can see how nicely that turned out. Stencils are created with little bridges, and what that does, it helps keep all of the parts and pieces in the proper place, and it provides a little bit more sturdiness to the stencil. In order for the letters to look hand painted as opposed to stenciled, I'm taking my Epic script liner and black green, and I'm just connecting where all those bridges are. It helps the letters to flow and makes them look very hand painted, just that little bit of paint. It may take 2 coats. You just have to look and see if it's nice and opaque and it flows well together. This only takes a minute, but boy, it makes a big difference. Adding just a little bit of water so that paint just flows on there nice and smoothly. Now that that is connected, I'm going back with a little bit of thicket. When I put this on, it just gives a little bit of an ombre effect from light to dark. I'm just basically tapping a little bit of thicket across maybe the top third of the letters, and this will provide a gradation from light to dark. Just have to be careful that it doesn't blend into the background. And I'm going to lift my stencil up just to make sure that I can still get that tone variation, but create that contrast against the background. So that's why it's nice to have that little piece of tape at the top to kind of be a hinge so that it can be lifted up and you can see what's going on underneath of it. And I'm just going in a little soft circle just to brighten up the top part of the letters. And just that little bit of paint really does make a difference. It lightens it and keeps it from being so solid and heavy. And once I'm satisfied, then I can just completely remove the stencil. Taking a little bit of raw umber, and everything has a nice shadow of raw umber. This is just going to provide a little bit of shadowing against the letters. This paint is so very thin. It's very, very transparent. I'm using my number 2 Radical Round to just line a drop shadow below and to the right of each section of every letter. And because this paint is so very thin, if I get a little bit on the black green, it will not show up. If it shows up, your paint is way too heavy. If it's a little bit wider or thicker than what you want because the paint is so thin, super easy. Just get a cotton tip swab or even just wipe it off with a damp paper towel. Obviously make sure the letters are completely dry before you do this. And it's such an easy way to add dimension and depth, and it adds a lot of impact. Just these little touches. My motto, a little bit of paint makes a big difference. And I've just stroking that on really rather quickly, right side and across the bottom. If you like the videos, please let me know if you have any comments or questions. I did the last one in real time. Everyone seemed to love it as opposed to speeding it up. So if your preference is still the real-time videos, let me know. If you decide to go ahead and paint this design, send me a picture. I love seeing the finished designs. Let me know if you have any questions or problems. Such a fun design. And I hope that you're able to take a lot of these tips and tricks that I provide into your painting world to make it just a little bit easier and a lot more fun. I always think if something is a struggle, there has to be an easier way. And if you're struggling with something, let me know. Maybe I'll do a video on it, or I can answer a question, make it easier for you. You can see how quickly this little drop shadow is going on and what a difference it makes. Once I get it all, the drop shadow on there, I'm using my splatter brush, just going to add a little bit of splatter using very thin raw umber. And with this splatter brush, I can really hone in and put it pretty much where I want it to be. I don't want these to be strong, heavy splatter dots. So after I splatter it, I take my distress sprayer and I mist it, and you can see how it starts to diffuse those speckles, and it just kind of makes them soft and obscures them quite a bit. They need to be muted and a little bit quiet. This is just filler to kind of add a little more interest in the background. I do use a heated tool to quickly dry. It's super efficient, very hot. It gets the work done very quickly, and I don't have to wait very long before I can move on. Because it's so wet, I want to make sure that it is dry. I'm lifting out some, before it's completely dry, I'm lifting out some of the heavier paint. The heavier paint takes longer to dry, so if it's too strong, it's just real easy to just gently blot and lift up. And it leaves another texture as well. So this is a great way to add speckling, mute it down, and lift off the excess very quickly, very easily. Just gives a really nice effect. After I added the raw umber, I thought it needed just a little more color, so I'm loading the splatter brush with Snow White just to add a little bit of sparkle. The white paint splatters are just a little bit lighter and a little bit more sparkly. They're not as heavy and as intense as the raw umber. So I did not diffuse those because I was afraid they would just basically disappear, and I wanted it to kind of be just a little twinkly background. I love how this turned out, and I hope you do too. The side edges may be left plain or painted with raw umber. I did erase all the tracing lines and varnished it with a couple coats of ultra matte varnish. Everything I used is listed in the links below. If you like what you see, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. That helps me, and you won't miss out on upcoming videos. I hope you learned a few new tips and techniques to make your painting life a little easier. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.